Massive thank you as always to our top tier patron, Sarah Turner. It's Not Just In Your Head is hosted by psychotherapist Dr. Harriet Frudd, substance use disorder counsellor Ikoi Hero, and myself, the editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So, if you can afford to give, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making the show. However, if you can't, then please just leave a review on your podcast platform of choice, tell your friends about us, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, or YouTube.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
My name is Shain Shapiro. I am the author of a new book coming out in September called This Must Be the Place, How Music Can Make Your City Better. In addition to that, I'm the founder of a music and economic impact consultancy called Sound Diplomacy. So we work with cities and governments all over the world on music, culture, and nighttime economy related policy and strategy. And I've done a whole bunch of work over the years linking together music and urban planning and the built environment. And in addition to Sound Diplomacy, I run a global nonprofit called the Center for Music Ecosystems, which is trying to incorporate music into solving the biggest problems that we're facing in the world.
We've had a couple of episodes. We did an episode about Our City's Good for Your Mental Health. And we had someone who does a lot of organizing around parking reform in the States. And again, revealing about, I guess, the intersection of infrastructure, mental health, capitalism, blah, 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 all connected. And in reading your book, that's very much how you're framing it as well. Like, this interesting thing of like music being this individual experience or like maybe a consumer choice, but that it's a systemic thing. And it's useful to think of music in terms of infrastructure, because when you do, various problems are solved. I don't know, maybe if you wanted to give a brief overview of how you conceptualize it and maybe perhaps what a music ecosystem is.
Yeah. So again, music is one of these things that we all share. There's very few kind of universal languages that can bring us all together or negatively impact all of us at one time. And music is one of those things. And yeah, we all view it in different ways, but if you break it down into its component parts, it's a key kind of variable or tool that unites all of us. And I see infrastructure in the same way. Infrastructure are all the things that we need to live, and whether it's water or buildings or land or so on. And I've always found music is one of those things that you may not need to live, but you'd struggle to live without. So I'm fascinated by how decisions are made to impact the places that we live, to make decisions based on improving our lives or choosing which resources go to what community and so on and so forth. And I've always found that music is a recipient of a lot of the decisions that gets made, but it's never at the table when these decisions are being brainstormed. So really the purpose of the book was to reset the table, to say, if we think about music a little bit differently as a piece of infrastructure, and within that infrastructure is an ecosystem, in the very basic sense of the word ecosystem, a whole set of component parts that when one is negatively impacted, it impacts the rest of everything that's tied to it, like a natural ecosystem. If we look at music that way in the places that we live, we can find how I think it uncovers so many ways that music can be positively impactful in terms of helping us make the best possible decisions for the most possible amount of people. And this incorporates the music industry, obviously, but also music's role in education and health and well-being and land use planning, and very much in terms of in supporting mental health and well-being and health and safety, everything. So the book is my attempt to bring it all together into a cohesive whole. And I hope it is. It took a while to write.
I think there's various interesting observations in there. I think, this idea that music is taken for granted, that on one hand, it's supremely important. Without music in TV or movie or sports events, or like you said in the book, like weddings and funerals, like it's a soundtrack to everyone's lives. And there's that sense of that because it's just ubiquitous, like people maybe don't value it or think about it in a particular way.
Yeah, because you're right. Its ubiquity leads us to forgetting that it's there. So first off, the music industry, the commercial music industry is very complicated. How people get paid and how music literally works as a business is not something that many people outside of the business truly understand. We tend to have very, let's say, front of house relationship with music, where we either listen to the finished article or the song, whether it's through a service provider, a digital service provider, or we buy the record, or we go to a gig. We don't really understand the mechanics and all the jobs and all the skills and everything that's required to make these finished products. We tend to not really pay much attention to how the sausage is made when we're eating the sausage, right? I'm not talking about it as a value issue or anything hierarchical in that sense. Like we're often unintentionally taking music for granted, especially because most people are passive listeners of music and they're not going to actively seeking out new acts to listen to all the time. Most people are listening to music as part of something else, as you say, whether it's in an advert or a film or at a sporting match or on the radio or whatever. And because of that ubiquity, we tend to lose sight of the power that it can have in making places better and in bringing people together.
Yeah. And also is that idea of when something works, you don't notice it. And you do point out a whole bunch of things that actually seriously aren't working and turn up as, to some degree, symptoms of a dysfunction of society or policy, if you like. But there's also this idea of because all this music already exists and lots of people enjoy it, then you don't really have to do anything about it because all this great music already exists. And perhaps this is a slight derailment, but I used to frequently go to St. John's Wood around that area. And for those that don't know, that's the kind of Abbey Road studio famous album cover. And like every time I was there, there's always people taking photos, right? Recreating the album cover. And it's that thing of St. John's Wood is a kind of fancy area, right, of London. And it's like, how many people now living in any of these flats are actually like professional musicians or even regular working class making a living doing music? It's like you do point out that the sort of the class issue involved in music and just relying on past glories. The Beatles came about post-World War II, where there's just lots of money for it's a much more socialist focused time.
Yeah, the music industry certainly has changed since the Beatles, and there's still plenty of money to be made in our business. That's one of the misnomers, is that the music industry actually, for many people, is doing very well. The industry grew by upwards of 9% last year, the recorded music industry, and live music is much bigger than it was pre-COVID. But it's become more of an hourglass than a pipeline, so to speak. The success is concentrated at the top and it squeezes the middle. But I think that what I want to see and how I envisage a city is a city that kind of treats music much like it treats anything else. In St. John's Wood, I forget what council that is, sorry, but in St. John's Wood, the council would have an understanding of the music infrastructure that is existing across the area, which I'm sure they do, and what the potential need is, and if they match up. And to ensure that there's music facilities and that there's an understanding that music is an economic and social good rather than just a tourist photo, right? Which is still important. People are probably buying coffees at local cafes, things because they're coming to walk across the zebra crossing. My hope is that it's seen much more comprehensively. It's amazing the cognitive dissonance that we have where, again, the Beatles didn't just happen. Taylor Swift didn't just happen. Like these artists who are iconic and are so important to so many people required a whole bunch of skills and educational programming and people around them to succeed. You're not born learning how to play a guitar. You're not born learning how to sing or write a song. So there's a whole environment that we can be more deliberate and intentional about creating to create more superstars in the world, as well as, to me, more just people who appreciate, perform, and engage with music in their daily life.
Yeah, you had this quote there. There's no music policy at the UN, IMF, or World Bank. No country has a minister for music. So that's the degree to which so much of this is taken for granted or invisible to some degree?
Yeah, that's one of my bugbears. That's something I'm trying to fix. It's my focus right now in my professional life outside of writing a book, that music tends not to be incorporated into how we solve or how we invest in solving the biggest problems that we face, whether it's how to get development financing more equitable and right, how to stop conflict, how to fight the climate emergency. Music is always something that's added on. It's bolted on rather than built in. And it's because we don't have frameworks and policies that explain how music can and should be incorporated into these global agencies. Yeah, the World Bank doesn't do anything really when it comes to music, other than there's been a couple cultural tourism initiatives that incorporate music, but that's the end. Again, that's front of house, not back of house. And I believe there's such incredible power in looking at it in a different way.
One of the things I thought was great was this idea of the agent of change principle.
It's not entirely a music or entertainment policy. So first off, it's the same policy. So one of the origins of it, and I think I wrote about it, is that people were moving next to pig farms and complaining about the smell. So it was an agricultural issue. I know this podcast is about mental health, and it's really hard to think straight and be comfortable with yourself when you're constantly feel uncomfortable at home. And the last thing that I want is people to be moving into their new homes, and those homes are not delivering from what is needed because of poor insulation. But the thing is, communities, we're going to solve our housing crisis by being denser as much as we are by building out. We need to build up. And one of the purpose of the agent of change principle is just to respect your neighbors, so that if you're building something next to something else, you have to ensure that whatever you're building is not negatively impacting your neighbors. So if that's building a block of apartments next to a music venue, the apartments need to be soundproof. Same if you're building a new venue next to a block of apartments. So I think one of the things that really supports city vibrancy, that makes places actually work, is proper building codes that take into account entertainment, culture, and music at the very beginning. Because if we all want to live in vibrant places, in places with great quality of life, you have to build that into how places are built. So The agent of change principle is one of the ways to do that. And it's something that I worked on here in the UK, and it has been adopted in a few other places as well.
Yeah, because that is exactly what was happening, right? Is that developers would come along, build a block of flats next to some sort of entertainment place. People would move in, complain about the noise, and the venue had to close.
Yeah, or was threatened. That's happened a lot. Certainly, it creates a lot of litigation, which obviously could then be reinvested in. Imagine if that money was actually spent developing artists or supporting a food bank, even, like anything. It's a lot of money gets spent because of bad decisions that are made in pre-application and planning phases.
One of the things reading throughout the book is anything in the arts, whether it's music, whether it's dance, it is in a lot of ways by society considered like non-essential goods, because you don't die without it necessarily. It's not like food or water or housing. And so it gets relegated to the sidelines. And one of the things about this book is ultimately, if you want to encourage something and make sure that entity has a vibrant place in society, that it needs more than just private market demands.
Yeah, we always joke that everyone's a socialist when they need help, right?
Right.
If you're desperate for an ambulance, then you're a socialist. Like and maybe that word to certain audiences, I know that has a lot of baggage. I don't mean that politically. But there are just certain things in communities that have non-monetary value as well as monetary value. And music is complicated. Some of it is more focused on monetary value, commercial tastes or mass market tastes, and some of it is more niche. But I'm a data and evidence guy. I'm like, whatever decisions that are taken in a community to invest in culture should be taken with, as we say, kind of evidence-based policymaking rather than policy-based evidence making. And music is an emotional thing. It's something that conjures up dopamine and emotions in all of us. And we tend to think about music personally. We don't tend to think about music structurally, as you said, Liam. And the book is my attempt to try to change that and say, listen, everyone can love what they love. Like, I'm not talking about anyone's particular love or dislike of any kind of music, but we need to look at music more holistically as a community development tool. And if we do that, then it has implications on building codes.
Building codes, zoning, various. How do you arrange for like public transport in specific areas? Those are the things that you want to make sure that a feature, right, that it's accessible, that it doesn't create conflict, that it brings more to the community, that it does require a lot of planning of those things. And we never think about those things in terms of the arts in general.
I think there's a lot of baggage there. There's a history of how we, in our, I said, Anglo-Saxon Western world, think of the arts. There's also a different way that Eastern culture and Middle Eastern culture and different cultures think of the arts. And the arts in many communities still is not an economy. It's not seen as an economy. It's not seen as something that you can pursue as a job. I can't tell you how many times when I was a kid and I was working in music, I was told to get a real job. I find that all very insidious, but I also understand why. And it's not something that you can just say, this is wrong. You have to present better solutions. And to me, that my book is my attempt to do that.
No, because one of the major things about having a wide range of music venues, and I know like you've mentioned places like Memphis and New Orleans and such, Nashville in the book. But one of the things is I would like the smaller venues and access to all these smaller venues do give a real opportunity to people who don't necessarily want this to be like their full-time job.
Right.
No. And I think that's one of the most, because there is only like a very particular set of people that necessarily want to be like full-time musicians as a long-term career.
Yeah, crazy people, as we always say.
There is a certain commitment. Just a lot of people love to dance. A lot of people couldn't hack being a professional dancer.
Yeah, I'm not. I think a larger, more engaged, active music industry in every community is a good thing.
Yes.
But that's not something that's going to happen everywhere. I know that. I think that you're right. When I was writing it, I wanted to just present a message that said that music, in whatever way that you experience it, whoever you are, is good. And we need to set up the circumstances to allow you to experience it more in whatever way that whoever you are, wants to do it. If that's going to 1 gig a year, that's fine. If it's joining a local choir, that's also fine. But in order to join a local choir, you need facilities to do that. And in order to go to that 1 gig a year, there needs to be that 1 gig a year that you want to go to. And so everything can be made more intentional. Everything can be more deliberate. And I see very little negatives to investing in music. The only negative is if it has to be reallocated from something else. But then it's just a cost benefit analysis of if we're putting $1 into something musical, if we're taking $1 out of something, then we have to look at what that cost benefit is. And if it demonstrates that there is no cost benefit, then I wouldn't be advocating to put it in. If you think about it, it's pretty basic stuff. It's just, what kind of place do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to live in? And if we want to live in a better one, then music is part of the toolbox to get us there.
Yeah. And the interesting thing as well in that was that if hip hop is like the most popular genre, why is a lot of school music education still based around sort of European classical and all that kind of stuff? Because from my personal experience, that stuff just left me completely cold, completely put me off music. And it was only through going to the pub and seeing a local band play that was like, oh shit, I want to do this. And then that was the beginning process of me learning guitar. But that has taken me all kinds of interesting places, right? I was essentially semi-professional, did music for television, did music for video games. So it's all great, right? But school was not anything to do with that
Yeah.
That's a huge part of the picture, isn't it?
A lot of music education is so important. I think without it, we have nothing. I always advocate for more of it, but I feel like we need more diversity in genre. Yeah. The reason why hip hop isn't taught as standard in school is probably racism. And hip hop is quite difficult to understand if you're not a fan of it, especially a lot of modern hip hop where people are rapping about their experiences or writing about their experiences, and they're having experiences that a lot of other people don't understand. But I think that we need to be pushing for a world that incorporates hip hop more into schools, but also supports and protects the grassroots music venues that you found yourself in, Liam. Like my background is a bit of both, but now kids are discovering music on TikTok and they're discovering music in completely different ways. And we have to be malleable and understand how music is being listened to, and also explain that how music is being listened to is changing how we pay for it. And in order to sustain and have a thriving music industry long into the future, we have to think long and hard about how we pay for it and how we encourage people to pursue their creativity and pursue their art.
Obviously, there's a bigger fight going on with the streaming stuff, because you talk about COVID-19 in the book and how obviously that was a disaster for all these venues and live music in general. But obviously streaming shot up and the profits of all these multinational companies that obviously increased. As that funny thing you said about there was a white noise playlist that's made like millions of dollars. But the key point being is that, as you said, 90% of streams go to top 1% of artists. That sounds like a sort of familiar ratio in other sectors of society as well. So that's a whole other kind of battle.
Yeah, the music industry is a mirror of society. The more unequal society is, the more unequal the music industry is. There are many countries in the world that lack copyright frameworks. Like many, I count over 50% of the world doesn't have robust, transparent copyright infrastructure. So that means that if you're an artist from that country, unless you essentially leave the country in terms of registering your rights outside of that country, then you can't get paid. So there's so much work to do to create an infrastructure and an ecosystem that demonstrates why music matters and how it can matter more. And yeah, the book, like the COVID section, I rewrote 3 times because things kept changing as I kept writing it. But yeah, there's a whole business in the music industry around AI generated music and sounds rather than music, like white noise or rain or things like that. And Epidemic Sound are one of the bigger companies in that space, but there's lots of companies that do that. And there's a lot of money to be made in creating a sound that sounds like clouds. But that's not a bad thing. That comes to the complexity of the industry. And I'm thinking, how can we be better at explaining all the opportunities that the industrial side of music could bring to a community by simplifying, explaining how it works?
But I guess what I find fascinating, and I'm sure you've had to do this dance, is how you define value or how you measure the immeasurable. Because the things presumably that are easy to measure and put in front of people's faces to convince them are probably economic things. If you can demonstrate that if you do X, Y, Z, you make money, then generally speaking, I can imagine that's a sums up. And sometimes those things align, right? If we can make money, then that's a good. And if people's quality of life improves because of it, that's great as well. But is it difficult to navigate this world? Because obviously what you're doing is really through the front door. It's above the line. It's working inside the systems that exist, right? For people's better quality of life. I'm just wondering is there any sort of struggles that happen where it always has to go through this sort of financial lens to justify policy? Is that what does it? Or is working with the state, does it have some space to go, this isn't just about money, this is about, quality of life, whatever that means?
It usually comes down to the economic impact. Unfortunately, I am of the belief that it's better to change the system from within than fight the system from without. Although I honor and impressed with people who are fighting the system from outside too. I'm very privileged in that sense, where I've been given access inside a lot of these systems. I think because I'm a white guy and I'm North American and I speak English in that sense. And I find that the social and cultural side of things is often quite lost. But what's most challenging is when the social and cultural side of music is recognized, it's not recognized alongside the economic side of music. And that's what needs to change. UNESCO are an amazing organization, and they've got over 150 countries to sign a resolution stating that culture is a public good. It's called the Mondial Cult Declaration. And that's amazing because that forces the governments to respond because they've signed something that says they have to do something. There isn't a link that says, okay, if something is a public good, then how do we invest in it to then grow it as an economy? And how do we link cultural and social development and economic development around music? It's sometimes one or the other. And that's something that I struggle with. And that's something that I'm working on trying to change. But we have to be better at recognizing there's a lot of these like top music cities in the world and top places to live. And they often completely ignore cities in the global south. And Lagos is, for example, is just as incredible and exciting a music city as any city in the world. But it's often not, at least from the Western perspective, it's not recognized as that because it may not have the robust policy infrastructure that London has, but it'll get there. And so I think we have a long way to go, but I'm very optimistic that we'll get there.
If all this stuff facilitates people making a living playing music and actually being able to survive off it, then that's a win.
Yeah, survive off it financially, or it impact themselves, their mental health, or just make them happier, make them more confident, provide some respite to challenging circumstances. As I've said, no one's ever been to a wedding or a funeral without music. I think that it's both of those things to me. If more people are making more money out of music, amazing. We need to continue to do that. But also music just needs to make people's lives better as much as it possibly can. And we need the infrastructure and to ensure that happens in more places.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Was it Music City or City of Music? These sort of terms that places trade off as a sort of tourist draw.
Both. There's both. There's the UNESCO Cities of Music Network, but then there's lots of cities that call themselves music cities in different ways.
And the issue with that being that that can appear that they are doing something progressive for the city, but it doesn't necessarily mean it. Like it can just be
a brand. Yeah. Depends on the city. It's a call to action. Nashville trademarked Nashville Music City when they're the leader in this space. But lots of cities that my firm Sound Diplomacy that I founded has worked on have developed music city related policies in different ways as well. Not all success, every city goes about it in a different way, but it's all about pushing to take music seriously, as I said.
So just because it has the label doesn't mean, because you have this quote, for something to exist, it must have a policy. It's just because it has that on the front window, as it were. It doesn't necessarily mean that in the background, they actually have the sort of functioning music ecosystem policy that you're advocating for.
Yeah, that is true. Not every music city is taking full advantage of growing their music ecosystem and incorporating the policies and practices that I write about in the book.
Yeah, because you do have this kind of blueprint. You have a sort of recommendation of like how all this stuff could be laid out. Do you have a kind of summary to hand that you think a successful music ecosystem or music policy looks like?
Yeah, there are a number of cities that I can point towards, which I do. Obviously, Huntsville, I write about a lot in the book. I think they're doing a lot of good work to really develop a music policy from scratch. London with the research and the work that was done to support music venues. But it's one of these things that like having an active music cities policy is just a process like any other. It's the rubbish is going to be picked up next week. And just because it was picked up this week doesn't mean that, what does that mean, right? It's a music policy is a process like any other policy in a city. So just constantly starting something and engaging in it and incorporating music into city planning and policy is a success to me. And doing it with an allocated budget and allocated staff members. And about 50 or 60 cities around the world have taken that and run with it in the last couple of years.
Yeah. And that initial setup for you guys for sound diplomacy, it sounded like it was really tricky, right? Because music wasn't maybe taken seriously or taken for granted. There was like 150 grants that you were exempt from as a business, right? Setting up or something like that.
Yeah. Like when I set up sound diplomacy, I couldn't get access to anything because I wasn't a startup because I didn't make an app, and I wasn't a consultancy because I was consulting on something that didn't exist. So there was a lot of, it took a while. And this isn't by design, because why would I design it this way? It just happened that way. And I had to create the market that I worked in. And we did it by giving a lot of this stuff away and by trying to explain ourselves. And now things are different, thankfully. But at the beginning, it wasn't easy. And now I've learned a lot from all the mistakes that I've made of how it can be better. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book is I wanted to provide something that was accessible to everybody, that at least line in the sand kind of thing. Now I've written down everything I know up until this point, and then we'll go from here. Thank you for featuring me and everything. It's a real honor you like the book. Thanks for reading it.
Yeah, a real pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I realize we've hit time.
Please tell all your friends. And I'll probably be on the West Coast sometime early next year as part of my book tour, but I'm doing the East Coast this autumn. But if you need anything else from me, just let me know.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again. Okay. All the best.
See you later.
A huge part of all these things is money, right? That's like the sad thing about the arts in capitalism, is that ultimately nobody carves out the space for something that's not profitable.
No.
Because that's one of the major things. Making a professional living out of a creative career can be really difficult. I've known a lot of people that went into trying to be like professional musicians. And the ones that ended up having the most longevity were like session musicians that weren't necessarily like creating their own work, but being hired guns because they actually really enjoyed the process of playing the instrument as much as like the creative process of creating new music. Creating new music is stressful. It's not necessarily for everyone. And ultimately, music is something that I want people to enjoy doing, not necessarily make into a career or a job. And I think if you're going to make it into a career and a job, also, it shouldn't be like poverty or extreme wealth. You should have more opportunity to be able to make a living, not necessarily a luxurious living that you can like subsist on, right? And like, we don't really have that middle ground at all in music.
No, and my personal background is that I never fully committed to just doing music because one, it's really precarious. Also, the time commitment for the reward seemed not particularly great for any kind of quality of life.
My advice to a lot of like my younger friends in my 30s, when I came across some younger friends that were 18, 19, 20, I think that's a really good age. Give yourself a nice time limit, right? And go fucking enjoy your life. And if that's committing to being a musician for a few years, do it, right?
Yes.
Because you can't do it when you have mortgage wife and kids or mortgage husband and kids. When you're young and unencumbered is really the opportunity to be able to do a lot of these things in life. Ultimately, yeah, like a lot of times the end result of it is that just like a lot of things, trying to make a job out of something that you really love isn't necessarily good for your love of music. Because I know a lot of people that try to be musicians where they got burned out and they were like, I haven't picked up my instrument in 5 years.
Yeah, that was also a big fear. Like I started to realize quite how stressed I was becoming with assignments. And on one hand, it's great because it makes you write a load of music. But on the other hand, it stops you doing it for reasons that are just joyful. And that became a really scary thing. It was trying to figure out like what's more important.
Growing up, I remember this was a lot more of a thing in my working class friends, actually. But the dads or like even the moms, some of them like being in a band as a side, just for fun.
Yeah.
And they would have like gigs at bars every now and then, but this was absolutely not for money. This was like purely for enjoyment. And I would like to see like more of that. Another thing too is people having to share homes, because even like 30 years ago when I was like 18, most of my friends who were fucking broke, mind you, that were in their like early 20s, right? Working jobs, waitressing, bartending, whatever, they could afford their own apartment, because when you have roommates, right? I think there are so many economic forces actually that is impacting like the drummer crunch that I see everywhere. And this is not meant to be like a derogatory statement against hip hop. But one of the things about the rise of hip hop is that people can't afford instruments.
Yeah.
Right?
Or a place to practice, really.
There is a reason that hip hop came out of the inner city, because the inner city is not generally known for people being able to afford instruments, people being having space or time, or usually you're living like sardines in an apartment in multi-generational, 3 generations living in, or an extended family oftentimes living in like a single apartment kind of setting. None of which are like necessarily environments for at least instrumental playing. There's absolutely skill involved in hip hop, sure. But it is a very different skill. Again, it's one of those things where like hip hop, you can actually practice quietly on your own in a way that you can't with singing. Because when one of my friends was like, oh yeah, I really think a big part of like mumble rap comes from like people not having a place to be able to like really even rap out loud using the full force of their voice.
Interesting. It's good that I'm still recording, because I think what I might do is add some of our stuff on the end of it, because I think we've touched some interesting points. Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Rebecca Johns, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Alexander Lashley, Sheena Belmas, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, Alexandra McCormick, Wig Shaker, Elizabeth McKechnie, Fontaine, Hartley Wilmoth, Red Yen Cola, Joseph Carreri, E, and Sean Venado.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And if you want to hear even more from Harriet, check out her radio show, Interpersonal Update, on WBAI and in the WBAI archives.